The power cut. It was one of those bone-chilling March nights where the cold settles deep in your bones and every shadow feels a little too close. After a grueling shift at work, I finally got home, hoping to relax. I tossed my keys on the entry table, slipped off my shoes, and sank into my favorite armchair. Cracking open a cold beer, I exhaled, savoring the rare quiet. But the silence was short-lived. Just as I took a sip, every light in the house suddenly blinked out, plunging me into darkness. I froze, beer still in hand, trying to process what had happened. The darkness was so complete, it felt suffocating. I peered out the window, and my heart skipped a beat. All the other houses on the street were still lit. Only my house was swallowed by the dark. A strange unease crept over me, stirring something primal. A feeling of being watched. Trying to push down the rising panic, I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and made my way outside to check the main breaker. My breath was visible in the freezing night air as I reached the breaker box, but when I opened it, I froze. The wires had been cut. Not frayed or worn, cleanly, deliberately cut. Someone had done this on purpose. My mind raced. Who would cut the power to my house? Why my house, specifically? My hands started to shake, but I forced myself to stay calm. Just as I was about to go back inside, a flicker of movement caught my eye. Through the front window, I saw faint beams of light sweeping through the rooms inside, moving in slow, deliberate arcs. Flashlights. I blinked, feeling a cold sweat bead on my forehead. Someone was inside my house. Someone who had cut the power and was now prowling through my home, through our belongings, like they owned the place. And then it hit me. My wife was asleep upstairs, unaware of the intruders lurking just steps away. A surge of fear coursed through me, but I couldn't call out to her. If the intruders didn't know I was home, I couldn't afford to give myself away. I crept around the side of the house, scanning for an entry that might give me the element of surprise. Every crunch of gravel underfoot, every faint rustle felt amplified in the silence. Just as I reached the back door, a sudden frigid gust of wind swept past, chilling me to the core. It was more than just the cold. It was the sense that I was being watched, that something, or someone, was following my every move. Suddenly, a voice cut through the silence, a low, sharp whisper that seemed to echo around me, yet I couldn't pinpoint its source. "We know you're here. Come on out. Or give us your wife." The words felt like needles pricking my skin. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel them, their gaze piercing through the dark. My breath hitched and I felt trapped. This wasn't an ordinary break-in. Whoever they were, they knew me. They knew my wife, and they had come for her. I steadied myself, taking slow, shallow breaths. I had to get to her before they did. I slipped through the back door, my heart pounding as I stepped into the pitch-black hallway. The house was unnervingly silent. I couldn't hear the usual creaks or groans, only the steady drumbeat of my pulse. In the darkness, I heard their footsteps, heavy and deliberate. They moved from room to room, as though searching for something. The flashlight beams swept across walls and floors, casting elongated shadows that seemed to stretch and shift unnaturally, like the darkness itself was alive. As I crept further inside, I could hear faint whispers, too low to understand, but enough to send a chill through me. I reached the base of the staircase and slowly climbed, wincing at every creak. I prayed the intruders wouldn't hear me, that I could make it to her room in time. Halfway up the stairs, I froze as I heard her voice. My wife. She was calling out my name, her voice barely a whisper, filled with fear. I quickened my pace, but as I reached the top, I saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway. Its face was hidden in shadow, and it was just staring at me. The figure tilted its head like a predator sizing up its prey, and in a low, guttural voice it said, "She's waiting for you. Come. See her." A shiver ran down my spine. I wanted to turn and run, but something compelled me forward, something darker than fear. I approached the bedroom door, heart hammering in my chest. I could see a faint glow under the door, as if someone was inside, waiting. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The sight before me made my blood run cold. My wife was standing in the middle of the room, her face pale, her eyes wide and unfocused, like she was in a trance. And around her, like dark spectres, were 3 masked figures, each one cloaked in shadow. Their faces were obscured, but their eyes glinted with a terrifying hunger. They moved slowly, circling her, like wolves closing in on their prey. My wife's lips parted, her voice barely a whisper as she muttered, "They won't leave." One of the figures turned toward me, tilting its head in that same unnatural way, and I felt a sharp pang of dread, as if it was peering straight into my soul. The others stopped. Their masked faces now turned to me, their gazes unwavering. The room felt colder, darker. The figure closest to me stepped forward, its voice a harsh whisper that seemed to resonate within my bones. "You should have left her to us," it hissed. "Now, neither of you will ever be free." A horrible, guttural laugh filled the room, and the shadows around them seemed to grow, twisting and writhing like living entities. I tried to move, to reach her, but my body felt rooted in place, paralyzed by an unseen force. I watched in horror as the figures closed in, their hands reaching out toward her, fingers thin and bony, like claws. My wife's eyes locked onto mine, filled with terror and something I couldn't name, as if she was already slipping away. And then, just as suddenly, everything went dark. The figures, the voices, the shadows, they vanished, swallowed by the blackness. I stood there, surrounded by silence, as if I had been plunged into some endless void. I reached out blindly, calling her name, but there was no response, only the deafening silence and the weight of the darkness pressing in around me. I stumbled backward, out of the room, tripping over my own feet, my breathing ragged. The house was still, empty, as if nothing had ever been there. But the memory of those voices, those piercing eyes, lingered, an endless, haunting reminder that the darkness would never truly leave. The basement intruder. The storm raged outside, a monstrous force that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the night. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain lashed against the windows of the old house. It was the kind of night that made you feel like something was watching you from the shadows. I had been staying in my parents' basement for the past few days, trying to get away from everything. Just me, alone, in the quiet solitude of the old house. The house was a relic of another time. The wood creaked, the floorboards groaned, and the dim lighting cast strange shadows that seemed to shift as the night deepened. It had always felt odd, even when I was a kid. I'd grown up here, but there was always something off about it. Something that made my skin crawl, especially at night. But tonight, with the storm raging outside, it felt worse than ever. The power had gone out an hour ago, and now I was sitting on the edge of the old bed in the basement, wrapped in a blanket, trying to ignore the unease settling in my chest. The wind rattled the windows, making the entire house feel like it was about to cave in on itself. I tried to sleep, but it was impossible. The howling wind, the cracking thunder, the creaking of the house. It all blended together into a constant, oppressive noise that made it hard to breathe. I tossed and turned, my mind racing, my heart thumping in my chest. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was being watched, like something was just outside my vision, waiting for the right moment to strike. Then it happened. A sudden, violent thud came from the basement window. It was loud, too loud, and it made me jump out of bed, my heart leaping into my throat. My breathing quickened as I glanced around the room, trying to make sense of the sound. I told myself it was just a branch from one of the trees outside, blown by the storm. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I moved cautiously toward the window, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The dim light from the emergency backup lamps flickered, casting eerie shadows across the basement. I reached the window and peered out, my breath caught in my throat. There, pressed against the glass, was a face. A pale, contorted face with wide, dark eyes staring directly at me. The face was distorted by the rain on the window, but there was no mistaking it. It was a man, his features twisted in a grotesque, unnatural expression. His skin was sickly pale, his lips cracked and dry, and his eyes were empty, hollow, as though they were staring right through me. I stumbled back, my heart racing in my chest. The face didn't move. It didn't blink. It just stayed there, staring at me with an unnerving stillness. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I just stood there, frozen in terror, watching the face through the rain-soaked glass. Then, as if sensing my fear, the man's mouth moved. He didn't speak, but I could see his lips forming the words. He was mouthing my name. My stomach twisted in knots. How did he know my name? I backed away slowly, my eyes never leaving the window. I didn't want to look away, didn't want to give him the chance to disappear. The storm outside was deafening now, but I could still hear a faint noise from upstairs. Footsteps. Someone was walking around upstairs. My blood ran cold. My parents weren't supposed to be home tonight. They were supposed to be at a friend's house for the weekend, leaving me alone in this old, creaky place. But if they weren't here, then who was? I turned toward the basement door, my heart pounding. The footsteps upstairs were getting louder, coming closer. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I realized someone was in the house. Someone was walking around upstairs and they had to know I was down here. I could hear the footsteps getting closer, the floorboards creaking under the weight of someone's steps. They were coming down the stairs. I pressed my back against the cold concrete wall, my breath shallow, trying to steady my racing heart. The door to the basement creaked as the handle turned. I gasped, a sharp, panicked breath escaping my lips. Someone was trying to get in. I stood frozen, not knowing what to do, my mind racing for a plan. I glanced at the window again, but the face was gone. I heard the footsteps moving closer, slowly, deliberately, as though they knew I was trapped. The door handle rattled again, the soft, scraping sound of metal on wood like the claws of a predator testing its prey. Whoever was on the other side wasn't in any hurry. They were toying with me, making sure I knew they were coming. I turned, my eyes darting around the basement. My only escape was the small window, but it was too high, too narrow to fit through without making noise. And then it hit me. The emergency exit at the back of the basement, the one that led out to the yard. If I could get to it. But just as I moved toward it, the door swung open. I froze. There, standing in the doorway, was a shadow. A figure, tall and dark, its features obscured by the dim light. It didn't move, just stood there, staring at me, its presence suffocating. I could feel the weight of its gaze, cold and unnerving. "Is that you?" The voice was low, almost a whisper, and yet it echoed in the basement like a scream. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My heart was pounding in my ears, my limbs frozen in place. I thought I might faint, or worse, that I might be trapped in this nightmare forever. The figure stepped forward, and I instinctively took a step back, my back hitting the cold cement wall. My mind raced, but I couldn't think of anything to do. The figure spoke again, its voice growing darker, more insistent. "Why are you hiding?" And then, in the blink of an eye, the figure lunged toward me. I scrambled, desperate to escape, but the basement door slammed shut behind me, locking me in. The intruder was upon me now, too close for comfort. I swung blindly with a piece of wood I found on the floor, but it was too late. The figure caught my arm, spinning me around, forcing me to face it. And that's when I saw its face. It wasn't the face from the window. It was worse. It was a twisted version of my own face. The eyes were hollow, lifeless. The skin was pale, drained of all color. And the smile. The smile was wide, stretching unnaturally across the face, as if it was being forced into place. "Why are you running, Alex?" the figure whispered, its voice cold and detached. "You know this is your home," I screamed. I fought with every ounce of strength I had, but it was no use. The figure was too strong. As I struggled, I could feel my body growing weaker, as if the life was being drained from me with every passing second. And then, just as I thought I was done for, a blinding light filled the room. The figure shrieked in pain, its form twisting and distorting, melting into nothing. I gasped for air, my body trembling with fear and exhaustion. The light grew brighter, and with it, the storm outside seemed to lose its strength. The wind died down, the rain faded, and the house grew eerily quiet. I stumbled toward the door, my legs weak beneath me. When I opened it, I found myself standing in the yard, the storm having vanished as quickly as it had come. The air was still, and the house behind me stood in silence. I turned around, but the figure was gone. But something wasn't right. I could still hear my name echoing in the distance, a whisper carried on the wind. I ran. I didn't look back. The warehouse horror. It was the kind of job you took when you had no other options. The night security gig at the old warehouse on the edge of town seemed simple enough. Sit in the office, monitor the cameras, and make sure no one was breaking in. The warehouse was in a remote location, far from the main road and miles away from the nearest town. There were no streetlights, no signs of life after dusk, just the occasional car passing by on the highway that seemed so distant you could barely hear the hum of tires. I had only been working there for a few weeks, but the place had already grown on me in an unsettling way. The air always felt heavy, thick with dust, and the building itself creaked and groaned like it was alive, reacting to the storms that rolled in frequently. But the real eerie feeling came from the silence. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the kind of silence that clung to your skin, pressing down on you like a weight. The kind of quiet that made you jump at every small sound, every shift in the shadows. That night, the storm was more violent than usual. The wind screamed through the cracks in the warehouse's aging walls, rattling the windows, while sheets of rain pummeled the roof like 100 fists. The lights flickered, then went out completely, plunging the warehouse into darkness. I wasn't surprised. The power had gone out a couple of times before. But I hated this part of the job. The moment when the lights cut out, and the world around you becomes nothing but a maze of shadows and creaking metal. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way to the breaker room, hoping it was just a flipped switch. The beams of my flashlight barely cut through the darkness, bouncing off the damp concrete floor and the towering shelves stacked with unused equipment. The walls seemed to close in on me, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed from somewhere in the distance. The roof leaks were getting worse with every storm. When I entered the breaker room, I clicked on the light, and that's when I saw it. A flashlight lying on the floor, a few feet away from the breaker panel. It wasn't mine. I knew I was alone in the warehouse. No one else was supposed to be here tonight. I bent down cautiously, my hand hovering over the flashlight as if it might suddenly jump to life. It was cold to the touch, and I could feel a weird sense of unease creeping up my spine. I stood up quickly, scanning the room. There was no sign of anyone, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The flickering light above me buzzed louder, casting erratic shadows that seemed to shift unnaturally on the walls. I decided I'd had enough of this place. I turned back to the hallway, but just as I did, I saw it, wet footprints. They were fresh, dark, and glistening in the beam of my flashlight. The footprints led from the door near the back of the warehouse toward the breaker room. I took a cautious step forward, then another, trying to figure out who had been here. The footprints seemed to just appear out of nowhere. There was no sign of anyone in the area, no reason why they should be here. They were wet, as if someone had stepped through a puddle, but there hadn't been any water near the break room. I backed up into the hallway, the flashlight trembling in my hand. I didn't know if I was being paranoid or if something was really wrong. That's when I heard it. At first it was so quiet, I thought I imagined it. A whisper. It wasn't coming from anywhere in particular, but I swear I could hear it like it was right behind me. "Get out, now." I froze, my heart racing in my chest. The air around me grew colder, and the quiet of the warehouse deepened. I turned, my eyes darting through the shadows, but there was nothing there. No one. Yet the whisper echoed in my ears, clear as day. I took a few steps forward, my breath shallow and fast. I was about to call it a night when I saw it. A crowbar, lying discarded at the end of the hallway. The tool was covered in rust, its metal gleaming faintly in the dim light. I hadn't seen it there before, and now that I was looking closer, I realized the ground around it was also wet. My pulse quickened and a chill ran down my spine. Someone had been here. Someone had been using this crowbar for something. Then, the footsteps started. Slow, measured steps, getting closer. Too close. At first, I thought it was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, but then the sound grew louder. There was no mistaking it. Someone was walking toward me. The echo of boots against concrete was unmistakable. I whipped around, shining the flashlight down the hall, but all I could see were shadows, thick and dark, swallowing up the light. My stomach twisted in fear, and instinct kicked in. I ran. My legs burned as I sprinted down the hallway, the echoes of footsteps trailing behind me like a shadow. My heart hammered in my chest as the air felt thick and suffocating, but I didn't stop. The emergency exit was up ahead, a thin sliver of light shining through the crack in the door. I could hear them now, 2 people running after me. They were fast, and their footsteps were heavier than mine, like they were chasing a prey. I reached the door, my fingers fumbling with the handle. It was stuck. My panic exploded into a frenzy, and I slammed my shoulder against it, forcing it open. I tumbled out into the rain-soaked yard, the cold hitting me like a slap in the face. I didn't stop to look back. I just kept running, every part of me screaming for safety. When I finally made it to the parking lot, my car was waiting, thankfully untouched. I didn't care about anything else. I jumped in, slammed the door and locked it. I didn't even bother starting the engine right away. I just sat there, panting, trying to wrap my head around what had happened. The police came but found nothing. No crowbar, no footprints, no sign of anyone in the warehouse. They asked if I was sure if I had seen anything. I couldn't explain it. The warehouse was empty when they got there, like I had imagined the entire thing. But I know what I heard. I know what I felt. And even now when I close my eyes, I hear that whisper again. Get out. Now. And I wonder, was it just a robbery attempt? Or had I stumbled into something far worse, something far darker, lurking in the shadows of that old, forgotten place? The warehouse is still standing, but I'll never go back. Not ever. And every time I drive past that stretch of road, I can't help but feel a cold chill wash over me.